Hello, comrades, and welcome to the Revolution Report. Today, we're talking about American socialism, something that many Americans might think is strange to say, those two words together, American and socialism. But as a longtime communist from the United States, I understand that, of course, there's nothing un-American about socialism. And my guest today, John Jackman, knows that much as well. He's a member of the American Communist Party. Co-host of DDGeo Politics, a great, of course, information outlet that has exploded in popularity over the past, I don't know, I would say a year in the alternative media sphere. And just all around great stuff. So, John, thanks a lot for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm really excited for this conversation and to dispel some of the common myths that America and socialism aren't synonymous or can't work together. So really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I agree with you 100%. In our discussion, I think the best place to start would probably be not even, contemporary socialism or anything in our lifetime, but really the history of socialism, right? The history of communism in the United States, because it has a rich history of socialists and communists fighting for workers' rights, fighting for civil rights. They've played a huge role in the Black liberation movement and the 20th century as well. I mean, there's so much we could talk about. So. I'll give you the first word, okay? You tell me what is basically you think the most significant period of American communist history and why.
Well, that's a great question. And just to start off, the communist movement in the United States played an extremely important role in developing the class struggle and really kind of creating the society of relations that we see today. But I think that to really understand the history of communism and socialism in the United States, you actually have to go even further beyond the formal establishment of socialism and even prior to Marxism to really understand the meaning and the significance of socialism and communism today. Because, we're in this really weird situation where today, the history of the United States is usually either painted all in black or white, right? If you're part of the establishment, you see America as this supremely good entity, almost inherently, like by virtue of some magical elevated status that America is better than other countries. And today, that line is used as a way to entitle us to dictate the vision of our ruling class onto the world. And then on the other side of the coin, you also have this substantial group of dissidents who are maybe are louder than they are actually more substantial in numbers. But nevertheless, these people often who claim to be left say that American history and America itself is inherently evil and kind of focus explicitly on the evils of chattel slavery, the genocide and forced removal of native people, and so on. But to really understand the significance of communism, we have to understand history, right? Because historical materialism is critical to understanding Marxist thought. And to really situating ourselves in the communist movement today.
Absolutely.
Because the real history of America, beyond these kind of black and white narratives, is much more grand. It's much more complex, and it's actually more beautiful than either of these kind of reductionist and idealist ways of thinking. Because the history of America itself is a history of class struggle, and this is a vital part of our story and American identity. It's the story of the growth of the working class, the abolition of slavery, the struggle for civil rights for women and black Americans, the industrialization of America, out of which sprung the trade union movement, sprung the legacy of agriculture, which inspired farmers' movements, which were positioned against the financial elites, the numberless strikes and political struggles, and the alliance between the workers, which broke down the social divisions that were imposed on regular people by the ruling class, right? This growing cooperation that we've seen over the centuries between black workers, white workers, farmers, intellectuals. This is all part of the American story, and it colors our communist movement today. Because what it is important for people to realize and note that the communist movement in the United States and the mission of the American Communist Party today is not divorced from American history, but in fact it draws on the authentic spirit of America, which means drawing on the best of all of these rich and revolutionary traditions that I kind of very briefly summarized. That's the goal of the American Communist Party, to embody this spirit and to give unity and direction to the aspirations of all normal working people for freedom and for a better life. And when we're looking at, even the American Revolution from the outset, Lenin called 1776 one of the great, really liberating, really revolutionary wars.
That's right.
And we also know that through the American Revolution, the establishment of the Constitution, how we wrangled control over our sovereignty. We also saw the extension of the popular franchise during the Jeffersonian period. And so I think that I look back to kind of that Jeffersonian period coming out of the American Revolution, where we saw the abolition of slavery in the North, the opening up of public lands, the battle against British dumping in the United States. All of these things greatly expanded the growth of the United States. And not only that, but also expanded dramatically the class of workers and small farmers who would ultimately form the backbone of our burgeoning capitalist economy at the time. And it also signaled the elimination of many of the feudal political and economic remnants that acted as a fetter on European economies and economies of that day. And that is really what unleashed America to become ultimately the economic power that it became. And we have to remember that when we're thinking about what is communism really, Marx said it well, that communism is not a state of affairs which is to be achieved, but it's the real movement that abolishes the present state of things. And in particular, the antiquated instruments of class oppression that no longer serve social, political, or the economic development of the people. And at the time, this is what the American Revolution represented. And then as we move kind of forward in American history, some of the first actually explicit experiments of actual socialism occurred in the United States. You had the utopian socialists that were present in the 1800s. And then from the very, very early stages of Marxism as well, you had very influential Marxist intellectuals who immigrated. Many of them actually settled in the Midwest, which I think makes it more than appropriate that a lot of our work is also based in the Midwest as well, and we'll be having our first Congress in Chicago. You had immigrants like Joseph Weidemeyer, who actually participated in the Revolution of 1848, who was in regular correspondence with Marx and Engels, and a coterie of other American Marxists too, based in the Midwest, who were actually directly drawing from Marx and were directly inspired by Marx and Engels, and brought those learnings into the class struggle of the time. And then, and I guess I'm just kind of doing a summary of American history at this point, but I think it's all important to mention.
That's good.
That the Civil War itself, W.E.B. Du Bois described the Civil War and then the period of Reconstruction as the Second American Revolution. And in his magnum opus, The Black Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois frames the black struggle in America in terms of proletarian language. And he laid out a future that he saw for a unified struggle between black and white workers. And this is where we start to get to the formal history of the American Communist Party, which was formed the Communist Party of the United States, which was formed in 1919. And it played a very important role in this effort as well, uniting black and white union workers, seeing many of the failures of the reactionary tendencies, of course, of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan at the time, who represented the most reactionary tendencies in American society, the Jim Crow laws, but also the Communist Party gave a guiding light to tendencies of people like Marcus Garvey, who, while still recognizing his brilliance and his contribution to uplifting the honor of black Americans, still had some reactionary tendencies of his own that served to, in some ways, divide the burgeoning American working class from having that unity. And it was things like the meatpacking organizing and the strike movement that was led by communists like William Z. Foster in 1918, actually before the Communist Party was even formed, which succeeded in bringing tens of thousands of black Americans into the worker struggle. Extremely powerful force to fight back against the tyranny of Jim Crow at the time, which, in addition to terrorizing black Americans, as I noted, served to divide the working class and really strengthen the hand of the big employers and the financial elite. And so it was this appearance of the Communist Party that played a very important role in raising the whole of black Americans to a higher level in their fight for fundamental human rights. Now, we're living at a time today where the spokespeople of the empire, whether that's from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party establishment and conservative and liberal mass media, will claim that socialism is inherently antithetical to the United States, that we have like some type of special economy, apparently one that's divorced from the laws of historical development. But I think that in the end, this is nothing more. And the fact that people believe this, it's okay. And ultimately, this is a struggle for ideas that we have to bring to the mass of people. Because this line that America is inherently somewhat anti-socialist, or by its fundamental nature is against socialism, this is nothing more than a desperate lie that the elite ruling class is nervously trying to maintain as their system crumbles around them. Leftists, it's funny because leftists will sometimes make the same argument, but from a position of national nihilism. And I don't want to overemphasize that, but it's true that, many of them say that nothing good can ever come from America, and that we're inherently reactionary and that fascism is guaranteed. But in reality, America is fundamentally the same as every other system, as every other empire throughout history. And like other countries today, it's also dominated by finance capitalists. Our country is dominated by these same forces. Our workers are systematically exploited and cast into debt servitude to prop up an oligarchy, an empire. And the cyclical economic crises that engulf America engulf all Americans. Americans are subjected to these too. And so, as with other countries, the class struggle has raged here as well. It's been a critical part of our story against the general crises today of the world imperialist system and today's neoliberal world order. So I just think it's important that we recognize that we are in the struggle for communism, whether the people consciously recognize it or not. And that struggle for communism is the struggle for America.
Well, you mentioned a lot of very interesting points there about history, of course. But, the topic of patriotism, I think, something you mentioned quite briefly there, is obviously very interesting because there's a lot of, self-proclaimed socialists and communists, mostly on the internet, that say that call anyone who basically believes that actually existing socialism had some merit to it. They call them patriotic socialists or tankies or whatever. I mean, it goes hand in hand with the fact that really socialism, wherever it's worked in the entire world, has always been patriotic. I mean, when the Bolsheviks took power, they took power with the help of the supposedly imperialist military, right? I mean, the soldiers that were forced to fight in World War I, they were one of the main demographics that helped the Bolsheviks take power from the Russian Empire. And yet, these same people that sort of denounce this the ACP's position, patriotic socialist position, they would be the same people that just see a soldier as a unit of U.S. imperialism around the world, even though the Russian Empire was an empire too. And it was even nicknamed the, prison house of nations. It had nations that eventually went on to be equal partners with the Russian people in the Soviet Union. But during the Russian Empire, it was, of course, not the same. It was an empire that exploited its minorities. And I think what's really interesting, this position that these people take, that the United States is somehow special in terms of the same material conditions that apply to all these countries where socialism was established, somehow don't apply to capitalism in the United States. Somehow the United States is exceptional when it comes to the historical materialist analysis of history, right? And when you really continue to look at this position that they put forward, right, it's almost like these people are actually taking an American exceptionalist position to begin with by completely denouncing any sort of progressive or radical qualities of the American working class. And it's really people that are trying to apply the lessons from Marxist movements in successful countries, which I'll reiterate were always supported the idea of the nation, the progressive elements of nationalism and not the reactionary ones. So I think it's good that people like in the ACP and the sort of new emerging tendency, or re-emerging, I would say, tendency of Marxism to try and apply the lessons from those places to the American experience and understand that workers in the United States are the people that should be represented in a party of the working class, essentially. Otherwise, what's the point of even having a communist party in the U.S.? So what do you think? What do you think are some of the main things that socialists and communists are doing wrong in the United States that are not basically on board with this sort of, I guess you could say, patriotic socialist idea?
Well, first of all, I just want to validate what you say. It's very true. Everywhere that socialism has been successful, there's been this element of patriotism that has been extremely pronounced. It's been a fundamental component of uniting the people and uniting the interest of the nation and clarifying the interests of that nation. And so we have to keep that in mind, because ultimately the struggle for socialism and communism is in large part a struggle for sovereignty. That's always been the case. In the revolutions of the past that you mentioned, whether the population is suffering from a class of exploiters whose capital is based in that domestic sphere, in that country, or whether it's foreign. And of course, today we understand the nature of capital is global, and we have these finance capitalists that have interests and accounts in offshore account, have money in offshore accounts, that have investments all over the world, that are basically washing money through countries like Israel and Ukraine. And so you have this class of what we call globalists, but this is really just kind of a global imperialist capital that is not loyal to any country. It's not loyal to any nation. And in fact, it acts parasitically on the interests of many nations all across the world. And America is no exception to that. And so when we talk about the need to be patriotic, we have to remember this context, that the American people are also being fleeced by a coterie of global imperialists and financial elites who are foreign, essentially, to the communities that we live in, that we, the American people, have an interest in promoting and in developing. So our struggle is also a struggle of sovereignty. In order to unite the people along a common line of interests, we have to recognize critically that we are all Americans. We are all members of this country. We share in a common culture. Of course, Stalin kind of outlined some of the components that comprise a nation, and America hits virtually all of them. We share a common economic way of life. We share a common culture. We share a common language, by and large, although that's not dispositive of what makes a nation. And it's true that what you say, that every successful revolution has been patriotic. I mean, Mao himself said that socialism not only may be patriotic, but that it must be. And other examples of this include Russia, as you mentioned, which the appeal to the interests of the nation was critical in developing the mass line of the Bolsheviks. Vietnam was similar, and actually Ho Chi Minh referenced explicitly the revolution of 1776 as inspiration, so I think that's also notable. In China, it was the exact same, and in Latin America, all of these, and in Africa as well, all of these struggles called for a sense of national unity, a sense of shared common national interests. Again, because this is what socialism is fundamentally about. This is about sovereignty. Now, in the American context, we have this unfortunate total rejection of patriotism. And to an extent, it's understandable, right? Because patriotism in this country is used in a way that is associated with major corporate power. We see the American flag being thrown in our face by all of these massive corporations, by our politicians, who are in fact guilty of crimes, of war crimes, of crimes against the American people, of economic exploitation all across the world and at home. And a lot of times that is done, it's true, under the banner of the American flag. But I think that we have to recognize that there's a difference between this type of what I call fake patriotism versus a real and authentic national patriotism. And Michael Parenti actually described this very well in what he called super patriotism versus national patriotism. But I actually like the term of fake patriotism versus national patriotism a little bit better, because I think that this patriotism of our ruling classes is inorganic. The dynamic that ends up asserting itself is that while our elite, our financial elite, corporate monopolies, legacy politicians wrap themselves in the flag to cover up their crimes, you have this kind of mirror image on the quote left, which have these anarchic tendencies, these ultra-leftist tendencies that will associate the flag as this embodiment of a supernatural evil. And actually, this works to the great detriment of anti-imperialist struggles and leftist struggles, because it paints the nation as something that is actually represented by our ruling class, that their interests, that the interests of the financial elite represent the interests of the nation, and that these groups of leftists, this segment of leftists, are fundamentally opposed to the good of the nation, to promoting our national development. And so I think that this is one of the key mistakes that we see that still finds itself entrenched in a lot of these leftist circles. And it's also, I want to note that it's aided in many instances by the ruling class themselves. There's a great book called The CIA in World of Arts and Letters that talks about the way that intelligence agencies and alphabet agencies propped up this sort of new left that took this kind of counterculture, had this counterculture essence to it that was inherently positioned against the interests of the nation, and that by elevating this form of the left, they were actually able to push the mass of Americans, push the regular worker away from a class politics or away from an anti-imperialist politics. So I think that those are a couple of the things that I wanted to mention. But I think that when it comes to your question, because I want to address your question more fully, what are other parties doing wrong? There's quite a bit. So I'll maybe go through a couple of points. First, I think that we need, in order to have a genuine communist line, we have to have a correct international orientation. This is critical because it paints the context of how we go about our struggle for sovereignty, our struggle for communism and socialism in this country. And that if we cannot be in a genuine solidarity with anti-imperialist struggles all over the world, then we are not going to form the correct line domestically. We will continue to be manipulated by the interests of our financial ruling elites who want to destabilize these countries and push their own economic agenda in this type of global economy. So it's very critical, especially now more than ever, that we have a correct international orientation. And when it comes to other left parties, there's really not many other left parties that have a correct international orientation. Most of the, quote, left or socialist parties, especially the democratic socialists, who really just kind of tail the Democrats, that we see today are still critical of countries like Russia and China, will still label them as boogeymen, and kind of embrace or provide a justification for the imperialism and the war and the intervention that we see in these other parts of the world. The other thing is that for the limited political parties like the Party for Socialism and Liberation, that might have a little bit better of an anti-imperialist orientation and are more critical of U.S. foreign policy, you still see this tendency almost to not really have a genuine solidarity with the anti-imperialist struggles of the world. But in many ways, parties like the PSL kind of project their own radical liberal social beliefs onto countries that don't necessarily have them, right? For example, like they'll kind of paint the social politics within China as being much more like liberal or, according to Western standards, culturally progressive than they actually are, right? Where China does embrace many of its traditions. They do embrace the idea of promoting family and family values, and having this kind of culture of respectability and so on. The same thing is true with countries like Russia, of course, and Iran. And to an extent that it aligns with the genuine interests, needs, and traditions of the American people, our movement also has to reflect that for it to be a genuine communist movement. And kind of getting to that point, none of the other parties, even the radical or dissident ones, on the left at least, have really shown an interest in going down to the countryside, right? These rural areas and small towns that have been decimated by neoliberalism, by the big agricultural monopolies, who have been dilapidated and are seemingly unworthy of any capital investment. And I think that is what's also differentiated the American Communist Party from some of these parties, is that we're not writing off these populations of people that tend to be more conservative as deplorable. And, Stalin said this himself, that at the time, for the line of the Bolsheviks, that one of the most critical things that the Bolsheviks needed to do, and that could be spared no expense, was connecting with the peasantry And Stalin recognized himself that even at that time, and it's similar today, that it's true that the peasantry at that time was more backward socially than many segments of the working class. But that didn't mean that they were written off. That meant that they had to double down in connecting with them and connecting with the language that these peasants had that could explain the world to them. And that is exactly what the American Communist Party is trying to do, is not writing off these people as deplorable, is not just saying that these people can't be connected with and that they're going to inherently be reactionary, but connecting with them on language that they understand to give their real concerns that stem from capitalist development, neoliberalism, all of these things, actual synchronicity, actual coherence. And so that's another major thing that separates the American Communist Party from the others. And then I think that finally is just not putting the culture war and identity politics as the main contradiction in society, which so many of these other parties do, which ultimately amounts to just tailing the Democrats. And this gets to the root of the split between the ACP and the Communist Party USA. And the Communist Party USA, as I already mentioned before, is the one that does have the legacy. It embodies the legacy of communism in the United States, but unfortunately, it has evolved into a tool of the culture wars and the identity politics that dominate our political discourse today. And in the failures of the Communist Party USA, you see many of the echoes of failures of social democrats in the past, which paved the way ultimately for fascism, right? Where, as with the German social democrats before World War II, they wrote off huge sections of the working class as irredeemable. And we all know what happened then. So we have to learn from these mistakes of history. And this is precisely what the American Communist Party has set itself off to do.
Well, I found the connection that you made between I guess you could say, countryside Americans, the inhabitants of red states, to the peasantry in Russia before and during and after the Soviet Revolution. I think that's a really good comparison, to be honest. And this is essentially what I understand, MAGA communism to be like, right? Because a lot of people have criticized this concept of MAGA communism all across the left, saying this is some sort of brown, red fascist idea, that this is just tailing Donald Trump and everything. But if you actually look into the people who are actually seriously pushing this idea of MAGA communism, you understand that there's no tailing going on at all. It's exactly what you just mentioned, really. Reaching out to these people, these workers in the United States with serious revolutionary potential. I mean, the reason why MAGA communism was coined as the term for this idea is because, of course, Donald Trump, when he ran for his first term, before he became president, he was running on a platform of independence from the capitalists controlling the Republican Party, because he was marketing himself as a candidate who was self-funded. And obviously, we know he's a capitalist. He didn't do anything for the working class. He, of course, was actually an imperialist in a way different from the Democrats. But at the same time, he made pretty much populist sort of promises to the working class that the Communist Party should have been making to these people, to be honest. I mean, representing their interests outside of the two-party system, out of the system that's funded by the major corporations that run the country, that run politics in general. And that's a message that, of course, these elements of the working class in the countryside reacted very positively to. And that's also part of the reason why elements in the countryside were some of the most revolutionary also in American history. I mean, you briefly talked about when we were talking about history, the Communist Party USA's integration of white workers and black workers into joint struggle, which is something that really was not taking place pretty much at all before the Communist Party was formed. I mean, poor black workers were actually often used by the capitalists as strike breakers before the Communist Party came around, because the black workers didn't trust the white workers because a lot of them were racist, and the white workers didn't trust the black ones because they considered them to be scabs. But the Communist Party was really the first political force in the country to allow for that sort of integration, to unite these two very important demographics in society in a way that, I mean, of course, without unity between whites and blacks, it's just not possible for any sort of productive drive towards a workers' revolution. I mean, what's really interesting is Harry Haywood's autobiography. Actually, Harry Haywood was, I mean, I'm sure John Jackman, you know who he is, but just for our viewers, Harry Haywood was a very influential black Communist Party member who was a lifelong party activist throughout the 20th century. His heyday of work was really in the 1930s, 1920s. But he talks a lot about all the work the party did to integrate blacks and whites into the same unions, which was very rare in the past. And it was on also Harry Haywood's personal initiative in the party, pushing that line, so that could be at the forefront of party work. And this really, I mean, it translated also into a lot of parts of American history that pretty much nobody knows about. I mean, we could go to the sharecroppers unions, and how the Communist Party was basically pretty much the only political organization that was based in the North that actually went down to help these sharecroppers unions, which were essentially underground militias of black sharecroppers who united together for self-defense because the police were constantly killing them without any sort of jurisdiction or regard for the law. And in states like Alabama and Georgia, where the police were essentially the same people who were in the Ku Klux Klan. They just changed uniforms between day and night. So that's a really significant thing in connection to what you mentioned about U.S. history. And I wanted to mention something else, but in getting into the sharecroppers history, where I lost it, because this is a really interesting part of history. Really, if anyone who's watching, you really got to read about the Communist Party's involvement in the sharecroppers unions in the 20th century. There's a good book called Hammer and Hoe that you can read, or you could also read Harry Haywood's autobiography. That's good too. I mean, the Communist Party worked with these armed sharecroppers who had no other choice but to literally arm themselves against Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan and the police there that, you know, were killing Afro-Americans there without any sort of remorse. But
absolutely. Well, and just to stay on that point quickly, it's a great piece of history that we need to study and appreciate more. And we saw the important role of the communists, of course, as you mentioned. And what was this all working toward? It was part of this effort to raise the black worker to the level of the proletariat, to incorporate them into the class struggle. Because the communists understood at that time, as we understand today, that the class struggle can only be empowered by incorporating people along all racial lines, along all ethnic lines, along all religious lines. And that this is how our class struggle can be the most effective, which is why they took such an interest in making sure that black Americans, sharecroppers at the time, were armed to literally defend themselves with weapons and basically militias against the terror of the Ku Klux Klan and against the terror of the Jim Crow regime. And as we've seen this develop, of course, we've seen more and more the black America be incorporated into the larger proletariat. We've seen the franchise of the vote be expanded. So now we have the tools more than ever to act as a working class, to uplift the interests of all black Americans, of all white American workers. And for those that say that we should basically go back to this identity politics that separates us into different camps based on race or religion, whether it comes from the left or the right, this is spitting on that legacy. This is desecrating that legacy, and it's lighting up, it's inflaming everything that those people, that those communists in the past, that those brave black workers in the past fought for. And so I just think that, I have to mention that because we see a lot of criticism that comes to the party because we take this line of not wanting to elevate identity politics as the main contradiction, but evaluate things through class. But this is actually the right lens. And this is the lens that ultimately addresses the disparities based on race as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And also on the topic of identity politics and this cultural agenda, it also is important to note that another reason why basically every communist party that's actually in power, or in the Russian example, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is not in power anymore, but is the second most popular party in the country, all these parties are actually against the cultural agenda. They're against identity politics because these politics are actually used as a vehicle of Western imperialism in these countries, because it's not really, it's sort of a radical change in the cultural identity of any society to suggest the kind of changes that are going on in the United States anywhere where a communist party is in power. And the government really, it's really not in line with the government's agenda in any of these countries to protect the sovereignty and tradition of the country. This is the case in the DPRK, in China, I mean Vietnam. We don't see any of this cultural agenda in any of these places, and these politics are really like the first vehicle that organizations like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy use to sponsor regime change in countries like the ones I just mentioned, or I think the biggest example that we can use as of recently is the Georgia example, of what's going on in Georgia right now.
Absolutely, and these things, these attacks on traditional cultures, for example, the attacks on Islam right now are one of the most poignant and important things to point out, that the Democrats and kind of social democrats have used to weaponize against anti-imperialist powers, right? This women life freedom movement in Iran, for example. How many democratic socialists jumped on that bandwagon, not recognizing that this was undermining the sovereignty of the material backbone of the Palestinian resistance, which is Iran and the axis of resistance. Yeah. And so the failure to recognize these things is definitely important to point out. But then even among segments of the left, I want to talk about how chickens come home to roost a little bit, because even among segments of the left that recognize what the U.S. is doing and portraying these other countries as inherently backward to justify imperialism, invasions, wars of aggression, and sanctions, they often don't recognize when that same tactic is turned back toward the American people, and specifically the American Communist Party. Because, for example, we uphold the fact that there's a lot of people in this country who value their Christian faith. And we uphold that as an important piece of our cultural fabric, of our religious and social legacy in this country. And, again, and just to kind of emphasize that point on things like religion and how they've played an important role in liberation struggles throughout history. I definitely recommend looking at actually Dan Kovalich's book, The Case for Palestine. He does a whole section about liberation theology in Latin America and how that was critical for the development of socialist consciousness. And so it's things like, upholding the most redeeming aspects of our religious fabric in this country, which are very important, because that too is being ceded to these reactionary elements. It's being ceded to the Zionists. And if we don't make overtures to, for example, the Christian Zionists who might have been duped by the economic and political elites to think that being a Christian somehow means supporting the state of Israel, we have to share with them the reality of what's being done to, for example, to Christian churches in Palestine, and the desecration of religion that is happening all over the imperialist world. So I did want to mention a couple of those things as well, just to give a little bit more explanation to what some of these parties are doing wrong and why we have to really stand with these cultures, even if in some cases they might be more conservative or traditional in some aspects. That it's important that we not make this the primary contradiction.
Mm-hmm. And obviously the American Communist Party is a new party, but it seems to have a seriously innovative line when it comes to what we've been seeing on the left basically since the collapse of the Soviet Union. What are some things that the ACP has done so far in its so far short existence, and how does it plan to change the political landscape in the U.S.?
Well, that's a great question. And I guess there's a number of places that I could go, but I guess I'll start with kind of the ACP's plans for socialism in America and what that looks like. Because I think that there's still a lot of concern that socialism just means this kind of top-down bureaucracy, this expanded government, this bloated government. We have this idea of socialism in America that it is based on basically a form of top-down control of scarcity. But this actually is the inverse of the reality, because right now we live in a system that is authoritarian in a sense, that is controlled by a small group of people who exercise complete domination over our economic and political way of life. So we do have centralized control in this country. It's just that that level of centralized control is not working on behalf of the people. So, part of our line and our plan is that actually by establishing a government that is controlled by the American people, that is controlled by the working class themselves, that we can actually eliminate a lot of the unnecessary bureaucracy, we can increase efficiency, we can bring capital investments back into the communities, and eliminate this economy of debt. And just to stay on that point for a minute, because this is a very important part of the platform, is debt forgiveness, both at the personal and social level. Throughout history, we've seen that this, for any progressive revolution, that debt forgiveness is often a central component of that platform. And today, it couldn't be any more important. The majority of Americans are in some way, shape, or form in debt servitude. Millions of people have debts they will never pay off, whether that's credit card debt, whether that's mortgages, a whole host of things, including student loan debt. And from a social perspective, 40 cents of every tax dollar that we have goes to paying the interest on the national debt, just the interest on the national debt. So a debt jubilee is something that is going to be central to the American Communist Party's platform, continuing to promote Americans' ability to engage in the economy. And so this is incredibly important. I think that the other important piece of this, and they go hand in glove, is land and property reform, right? In terms of land, addressing the fact that agricultural monopolies have deserted small farmers, right? They've completely dominated our agricultural system. We need reparations both in terms of land and property by everyone who's been screwed by the system, including the dire need for Black America, which has substantially less wealth in terms of property. So land reform and property reform is extremely important. And this is another example of a way that we can unite the working class, unite the farmers and the people who have live in these rural and small towns who've been eviscerated by neoliberalism, and align their interests with that of the workers in the inner cities, urban areas, and more developed parts of the country, that they share a common interest in seeing this land reform. Because what our generation has to go through today is we're experiencing a level of contradiction that hasn't been seen in a long time. For example, for your average home buyer, your monthly mortgage that you owe the bank is now nearly 50% of your income. And so dealing with this type of abuse by the financial sector is critical, and doing things like nationalizing the banks to comport with a rational social plan that isn't just used to further enrich the people who already exert extreme leverage, the creditors and financial elites that exert extreme leverage over the economy, but a kind of rational social plan that uplifts and strengthens American industry rather than deindustrializing America and putting workers into this neo-feudal serfdom that we're currently in. So I think that those are some of the core points. But when it gets to the particularities of what we'll pursue, this is going to be shaped by the working class themselves, and it will be reflected by the needs of the workers.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, John, we're out of time, so I'm going to have to cut the live stream. But it was a great discussion. A lot of really interesting points you made about, of course, the history of the Communist Party, but also about ACP, because it's a new party, like we mentioned, and a lot of people watching maybe don't know all that much about it. But it's a party that I'm very optimistic about, and I wish you and the rest of the comrades in that party all the best. So once again, thanks a lot for coming on the program, John. Everyone who's watching, make sure to follow John on his Twitter. It's in the description. He's also co-host of DDGeo Politics, so definitely check him out there. And there was one more link, right? That you sent. Yes, and the ACP. Yes, the ACP website. That's also in the description. I added it there. So definitely make sure to check out all those links. Really interesting stuff going on. So yeah, comrades, that's all. And we'll see you in the next live stream. And workers of the world unite.
Thank you very much, Don.
Cool. All right, we're no longer live. That was good.
Awesome. Yeah, how'd it go? Sorry, I was a little long-winded on a couple